All right, hello everyone. I think we'll get this started. I'm Gabriel Metcalf. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and you are joining for the latest edition of Committee for Sydney Live. We're so happy today to be able to have Greg Clark speak to us from London. Greg will be known to many of you as a longtime close friend and collaborator with the committee. We are very pleased that HSBC is sponsoring this talk today and making Greg available and supporting him to do this. So to introduce Greg, I would like to bring in Hamish Kelly, who is the head of global banking for HSBC in Australia. Thank you, Hamish.
Thank you, Gabriel. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. As Gabriel mentioned, my name is Hamish Kelly, and I'm the head of the global banking business here for HSBC in Australia. Now, before we begin, I would like to quickly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders, both past and present. HSBC are very proud to be working with the Committee for Sydney to bring you this online event, which is part of the CFS Live series. I'm sure most of you are joining us today from your home, as I am, and indeed our guest speaker is all the way from the UK. And as we try to keep pace with a quickly changing business environment, we recognise the challenges that each of you face. As a global bank, HSBC are committed to supporting our clients and the communities in which we operate through this time. We continue to take a number of steps to help customers on both a financial and practical level. We recently announced donations to the Australian Red Cross and Barnardo's Australia to help support vulnerable community members impacted by COVID19. And these donations form part of a global $25 million commitment by HSBC to support the international medical response to COVID-19. We're delighted to be able to work with the Committee for Sydney to help provide the business community with insights that may assist you to formulate your own future strategies. And while Australia has so far had some success in flattening the curve, we're all acutely aware of the potential for a second wave of infections, as well as the unprecedented economic impact of this crisis. And amidst all of this, there is much discussion about whether the pandemic will change how we live and how we work. City planning is a prime example of something that may change significantly. And with a global footprint, over 63 countries and 300 cities, the future shape of cities is of immense interest to HSBC. As the world emerges from this crisis and considers steps to mitigate against future pandemics, what does this mean for cities and what opportunities will it provide? These are some of the areas that our guest speaker will discuss today, and I know many of you are familiar with Professor Clark. But by way of quick introduction, Professor Clark is a Senior Advisor and Global Head of Future Cities and New Industries at HSBC. He works with our global client base on the business and investment opportunities of an urban century, accompanied by the fourth industrial revolution and the climate emergency. Alongside his work at HSBC, Greg is a board member of Transport for London and chairs its investment committee. He's an honorary professor in urban innovation at University College London and Strathclyde Universities. Greg is a global fellow at the Brookings Institution, senior fellow at Urban Land Institute, and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Greg is going to speak to us for about 25 minutes and then be joined by the CEO, Gabriel, as introduced, who will manage the Q&A. Now, please do use the Q&A functionality that you will find on the menu for this Zoom webinar to ask any questions of Greg. And please all join me in welcoming Greg.
Well, good morning to everybody from London. Good afternoon to you in Sydney, and hello and welcome to everybody around the world. Let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which the people in Sydney are meeting today. And let me say a very big thank you to my esteemed colleagues at HSBC Australia, and of course, my established friends at the Committee for Sydney. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you today about COVID-19 and what it means for the future of cities. And I want to observe there are really three ideas in what I'm going to say to you. The first one, of course, is that COVID-19 is an international health crisis, and that we'll talk a little bit about how that health crisis is playing out. The second idea is that, of course, COVID-19 is producing a major economic shock, and we'll discuss what aspects of that shock will be and how that will play out in our urban and regional economies as well as at national level. But the key idea I want to impart today, of course, is that COVID-19 is also a rather unusual kind of opportunity, a catalyst, if you like. As the introduction to this event suggested, COVID-19 is a kind of accidental experiment in a certain way of living that could lead to long-term changes if we decide to take them and to seize them. So today I'm going to focus quite a lot on what those opportunities are and how we should shape them and manage them. You'll hear quite a bit about pandemic management, the impact on economic sectors, and we'll talk quite a lot about this accidental experiment in low mobility, low consumption, low carbon, low touch, high digitization, relocalized, and self-reliant and mutually reliant living. In a way, the core question is, how different will the new normal be from the old normal? And what do we need to do to shape that and to give it its color and its context? Now, COVID-19 is very important for our bank. HSBC, as many of you know, is a bank that's really grounded in global flows of trade, of people, of capital and ideas. And if you think about HSBC's presence in its 20 most active cities around the world, you can see that the bank that spans 63 different countries, operates in 300 cities, is focused on trade and cross-border activities, and in the last decade has really made a major commitment to sustainable finance. The global network of companies that we serve and the global cities in which we're located mean that our 236,000 people are particularly concerned with COVID-19 because of its concentration in the most globalized, most interconnected cities in the world. The motto of our bank is "Together we thrive." This is an urban message as well as a banking message. And so as we go through this, I'll be talking quite a bit about how the bank and its clients have been adjusting and responding to what's happening as a result of COVID-19. Let's go immediately into some of the data that many of you have already seen, I believe, on your television screens and in your newspapers and through your digital links over the last period of time. We know how COVID-19 is beginning to behave as a pandemic. We know which countries have been exposed. We're all familiar now with what the curves of infection and the mortality rates have been. And I think in the bottom part of this slide, you can see quite clearly that there's a big difference between, as it were, the personal medical interventions that have been made, but also the very widespread changes that have happened to how we use public spaces, how we use public transport, how we engage in buildings and shared spaces. If you like, the systems and services of the cities have been most interrupted, and the cities, as you can see on the right-hand side, have been the places which have been most impacted. If we look at how we expect the recovery to perform and what the shape and nature of the recession will be, you can see on the left-hand side a series of the more developed economies of the world where one or more version of a V-shape is anticipated, although you can see very clearly on the right-hand side of each of these shapes that the length and extent of the recession that we're now expecting is growing all of the time. On the right-hand side, you can see how some of the emerging markets in the world are anticipated to change as a result of this. Again, much longer V-shapes than we were expecting, underlying the idea that we're going to have a longish recession, one that's going to be sharp at the beginning, deep, and will last for a long time. And as always, the issue with recessions is the sorting effect that they have, producing winners and losers, prioritizing those things that have a future, and as it were, eliminating those things that don't. So we should see recessions in this context as a process of change, a little bit like COVID-19 is itself. Coming to the public finance dimension of this, as many people will be aware, there's been a massive engagement of public resources in supporting companies, workers, sectors of various kinds, and also supporting infrastructures during this period. Along the top line, you can see the nature of the public investment that's been made. And along the bottom line, you can see the consequent impacts on public debt of all of these attempts to support workers and businesses. One of the consequences of this is that whilst many people are talking about an investment-led recovery with a focus on a new set of priorities, part of the challenge is going to be the fiscal headroom that's available for countries to actually make the investment that we want them to make. Now, we can start to talk about the impact of COVID-19 in terms of the sectors. This is a chart that looks particularly at the consumer behavior that's resulted since COVID-19 struck. And if you just take this in a very simple way and look at the 4 bars on the bottom of this chart, you can see a set of sectors that have been highly negatively impacted: hospitality, restaurants and catering, travel and tourism, some aspects of education, the lodging parts of real estate. We all understand this. And over on the right-hand side, you can see the sectors that have had a temporary boost from this: healthcare, agriculture, education, utilities, public services, not the least. One of the consequences of COVID-19 is that it's starting to identify which parts of our economy are going to take much longer to return, those that are dependent upon a universally available medical solution, and which parts of our economy we're temporarily using much more as a result of the lockdown measures and other measures that are in place to manage the pandemic. If we shift that into thinking about how market performance is beginning to occur, particularly in terms of share indexes, you can once again see, a green group of winners, a red group of losers, and an intermediate group where it's unclear what's going to happen. And as you would observe, if you look at the right-hand side of this, this is also represented in all of the aggregate performance of stock markets and investor activity. Investor sentiment in this slide is also, widely recognizes this winners and losers paradigm. And if you simply look at the bottom right-hand corner of this chart, you can see some of the winners and some of the losers in terms of where investors are planning and have appetite to locate capital in the current moment. Now, I want to dwell for a minute on this slide because what we've tried to do here, down the left-hand side of the slide, is to plot, as it were, 3 medium-term health scenarios. These scenarios are based on the medical interventions that are possible. So you see, for example, the widespread use of anti-inflammatories, a medical response to manage the virus in individual people. You can see the arrival of antivirals, a medical intervention that will help us to reduce the spread of the infection. Or you can see a universally available vaccine, a kind of preventative care approach. If you scan across the slide, you can see not only what is required of government, what degree of consumer confidence this would provide, but on the right-hand side, we focus then on which kinds of sectors in the economy would be able to fully open up as a consequence of these different medical scenarios. Now, I'm making this point rather deliberately with you because I think the key underlying idea is that different parts of the economy are more sensitive to the citizen confidence, the investor confidence, and, as it were, the media confidence that will result from different kinds of medical intervention. And the length and duration of time that we have to wait until the different medical interventions are available will determine how much of the behavior that is, the changed behavior that is being used during the lockdown period and the transition towards a recovery, how much of that behavior will be carried through into a new normal, something we're going to talk about shortly. So I want to now make the point that we should begin to look forward to some of the things that will shape the new normal as opposed to the old normal once we're completely through the process of the pandemic itself and the economic shock that's going to come out after it. I want to think about this not just in terms of, as it were, a predictive model of what may occur, but rather an observation of some of the themes that seem to be arising from COVID-19 and how they may play out in the way we try to shape a new normal and how different it may be from the old normal from which we've come. There are 7 themes here, and I'm going to cover them very quickly. The first one is about supply chains and the flows of trade. One of the things that's been very obvious from the COVID-19 pandemic is that many countries have discovered that the globalized, highly specialized supply chains in which they've been participating have not been resilient to the kind of shock that we've had. And as a consequence, there have been shortages, rather obviously, of personal protective equipment in the medical system. But there have also been big changes to what kinds of food are available in different markets, as well as which components of manufactured goods have been able to arrive from one place to another. This has given rise to a major agenda to diversify, make more resilient, and in a certain sense, relocalize many supply chains. Somebody described this to me the other day as shifting from a just-in-time model to a just-in-case model. In other words, resilience in supply chains, having a diversity of places and choices from which essential goods can be procured, is a kind of new imperative that has been revealed by the challenges of fulfilling the requirements of each economy during this period of shutdown of various aspects of global trade. A second interesting theme that's emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic has been this digital transformation. If you like, we could say there's been a major uptick in the way that digital platforms, domains, and services are used. This has been expressed, of course, in terms of teleworking, video conferences. It's happened in terms of distance learning. Certainly, digital entertainment has received a massive boost. There's been a strong focus on using telemedicine as one part of how we tackle the virus. And as a consequence, there's been a surge in demand for data, a surge in demand for reliable digital infrastructure, major anticipated growth in data centers, cloud systems, and everything else. Some people would say that we have, in a sense, jumped a whole cycle in our use of digital platforms. And the question we have to ask is, how much of this behavior are we now becoming accustomed to? How will our working patterns, our learning patterns, our consumption patterns, our medical systems change as a result of this? We'll come back to some of that. The third big theme that's emerged really from COVID-19 has been a renewed priority and renewed focus on health and wellness. On the one hand, COVID-19 has revealed very significant health vulnerabilities, and it's also revealed very significant health inequalities, particularly in nations where there's been a high degree of infection and high morbidity and fatality rates. It's been very clear that these fatalities have been concentrated amongst certain groups of people, people who are less well off, people who are disadvantaged in other ways, the elderly, people who've gone into this process with pre-existing conditions, including in particular respiratory diseases. So as a consequence, we think that there will be arising from this a more profound focus, not just on better health care, although we think that will exist, but also on more healthy living and tackling some of these vulnerabilities through lifestyle, through the way we live, and through how our health services are provided in the future. If you like, a major pressure emerging all over the world for governments to do more to try to guarantee life expectancy and better health outcomes for everyone. This theme is closely linked to the next theme of climate change. One of the reasons that respiratory health has been such a challenge and has proved to be such a vulnerability is because many people, of course, live in environments where there's very poor air quality. And this link between planetary health and human health through the medium both of carbon emissions and air quality on the one hand, and through the food supply systems and our disruption of the animal kingdom and its ecosystems on the other hand, has produced in many quarters a kind of powerful new mandate to tackle climate change more effectively when we come out of the pandemic, and to make sure that the way our food systems are organized and the way our air quality is created are not some things that are going to contribute to further pandemics in human health as we go forward. So we expect to see some kind of renewed focus on climate change and an emboldening of government and indeed corporate intervention in that space as we proceed. The fifth big theme is to do with new spatial patterns. It's very obvious that if people are not able to ride on public transport because it's not safe, at least until there's a vaccine, and if people are getting used to remote working, digital learning, consuming products through on-demand delivery to their homes, this has a big effect on shared spaces, public spaces, stadiums, convention centers, shopping malls. It also will have a big effect on how offices are configured in the future. If any of this behavior is carried from this crisis through to the new normal, we will have to reconfigure our public transport systems, and we'll have to complement them with all sorts of active transport. We'll have to take steps to ensure that people don't simply jump back into the motor car, even though it will feel like it might be the safest option, because that will, of course, contribute more to poor air quality and therefore to respiratory ill health. We'll have to think about how we reconfigure office buildings and right-size them for the new ways in which they'll operate in the future. And these spatial patterns could play out over several cycles. But it's clear that some of the behaviors that have already been undertaken during this crisis are already being described as permanent changes in the way we use our real estate, our mobility systems, and our public spaces. The sixth big theme that's emerged from the crisis that could be part of this new normal is the theme of geopolitics. On the one hand, we've had a major change in the relationship between citizens and governments, as it were, with governments being required to guarantee public safety and public health. There's been a renewed focus on the role of governments in citizens' lives. Now, of course, there's been some reaction against this in many quarters, and there will always be reaction against big government. But on the other hand, this has been an opportunity in many countries of the world for governments to re-legitimize their role in people's lives and to demonstrate that guaranteeing public safety as a primary focus of all governments leads to perhaps a much more pervasive role of government in our lives than we might have thought before. At the same time, on the geopolitical scale, there's been something of a return to a national competition model, as it were, as countries have recognized that the relocalization agenda, the challenges around supply chains require them to think about their nation first in terms of access to essential goods. And of course, there are some new aspects to the dialogue about the relationship between China and the US, the role of China and the US in the world order. Now, the seventh big theme that I think emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic is what we might call a new social contract. As it were, on the one hand, people have had the chance to lead lives which are a little bit more localized. There's been a strong focus on mutual aid and on a collaborative endeavor at the neighborhood level. There's been a strong recognition of the important role of key workers, particularly healthcare workers, but also others in our lives. There's been a demand, as it were, for a new recognition of the role of people who work in public services. And there's also been a much stronger focus on the challenges of health inequality that I mentioned before, resulting in a desire for a much more coherent, much more equalized or harmonized approach to how we live in the future. At the same time, I think there's been, with the growth of the digital economy, some concerns about fair taxation of digital industries and whether all corporations are paying their way. So in this area, we may well see some important imperatives for reform, both of emphasizing the importance of renewed social capital, but also of much more fiscal solidarity, as it were, between different industries, different companies, and different parts of the world. So these 7 themes, it seems to me, arise from COVID-19 and have the power to be important influences in what comes next. And I want to talk about that now briefly in relation to cities and where cities may go as a result of COVID-19 as we move forward. Now, many of you know that this contagion has been very concentrated in cities. And on the right-hand side, my colleagues at UCL and the Business of Cities put together some data for me, just looking at the death rate per 100,000 population, looking at the major cities in the world. You can see the challenges faced by Milan and Madrid and New York and others. I suppose what's important to reflect here, of course, is that there are a number of very large, very dense cities that are not listed here on this chart in the way that you might have expected them. For example, if you look down at the bottom and you see Beijing, Shanghai, Seoul, Hong Kong, Singapore, these global cities are perceived to have managed very well, and I suspect there'll be some bonusing of them as a result. But it's important, I think, to recognize that COVID-19 arrives, in a sense, just as we enter the 5th decade of the urban century. This is the century when we've moved from 40% of all people living in cities in 1980 to 80% of all people living in cities in 2080. And at the same time, the world's population growing from about 6 billion to about 9.5 billion in that time. So more or less a tripling of the number of people in the world who live in cities. And you can see, of course, that cities have been a key epicenter of the contagion. Cities that are connected globally, have large numbers of visitors, have diverse populations, have been as it were, particularly exposed. And we've seen this play out in our media. But this results, I think, in a very big question. Will we therefore see COVID-19 as an event that seeks to reverse the century of the cities and try to, as it were, encourage a shift back towards a flatter world, a world where we benefit less from the concentration and agglomeration effects of cities, a world in which we emphasize instead some of the downsides of cities, the problems of congestion, of pollution, of inflation, and of course contagion as well. Well, I think we have to step into this discussion and say, will we see then this unbundled city that many people in the media are beginning to talk about, or will we go back to our old normal of the centripetal city, the city where we optimize the benefits of shared systems, we optimize the agglomeration advantages for businesses, for workers, or for investors, of being able to link and match with each other, and we emphasize the role that cities can play in taking large numbers of people out of poverty. This debate is already in our media, and it's certainly in all of the chat rooms that I occasionally visit. And for many people, COVID-19 is an opportunity for them to state their opposition to urbanization and to begin to dream about an alternative where this unbundled city emerges. Well, it won't surprise you to hear that my view is that this is a kind of false dichotomy. And I would prefer to see this current situation not so much as a restatement of the old normal, going back to the centripetal city, or the establishment of some kind of extreme new normal, the unbundled city. I think rather we should look at COVID-19 as an accelerator of a whole series of changes that we've already seen. Just for today, I'm calling this the blended city. I think in the blended city that arises from COVID-19, we take the localization agenda and the economic diversification agenda that comes from our changed supply chains and trades to produce this kind of distributed urbanization. The benefits of proximity, everything we get from that, but coupled with a much larger effective scale. So metropolitan areas, polycentric approaches, neighborhoods that become centers in their own right, a key part of this. We have the benefit of specialization with different cities and different locations within cities continuing to concentrate, but we combine those with the kind of flexible working patterns that have been established during the pandemic. We have competitive city regions that will have very physical, strong physical and spatial platforms, but we have the discretion to gather virtually and flexibly as well. So I think this heralds the kind of rise of a networked region, with strong localization effects and in specific industries. And the blended city has a kind of resident and non-resident dimension to it. Very grateful to my colleague Caitlin Morrissey, who spent some time producing this rather lovely visual for me. So in the top left-hand side, you see the physical city, the city that we've been used to for the last 100 years or more, where we benefit from having all of these assets and amenities and opportunities in one place, as it were, the city as a shared physical system. This city has, of course, been evolving over the last 4 decades as digital technologies have been more available to enable us to optimize how it performs. And of course, we've experienced all the challenges that we understand about congestion, pollution, and inflation in this city because of the very high demand. As I've said many times on my visits to Sydney in the past, congestion is actually a kind of hallmark of excess demand over the supply of the systems. In other words, it's an indicator of success, but only if you use it to expand the systems that you have. On the right-hand side, you see the virtual city, the city which comes from the high levels of digitization that we're now using, where we connect to the office, to the shop, to each other, to medicine, to learning, and to many other things using digital and virtual platforms. As it were, we have virtualized the city so that we can participate in it, whether we live anywhere near it or not. Now, in the blended city, that I think is, as it were, the next form of city we're going to get down at the bottom, you see the combination of these two things. And I guess I would say that life in the blended city may have the following ingredients. On the one hand, it's got a new industry mix, doesn't just specialize in advanced services and consumer services. It's able, through relocalization, to begin to produce some of the things it needs, not least food, but I think also many other components and activities that are required. It has multiple centers and nodes. It's not just concentrated in a single CBD. It might have 2 or 3 or 4 major CBDs, but also other local centers where people who are doing flexible working and others may gather. It has plural kinds of land uses. It's a city where mixed use is absolutely ubiquitous and where we're able to flexibly use land and building in different ways as required. We have more agile real estate. It has a multimodal transport system and a matrix of journeys that go in many different directions. As people who are able to move from traveling to the office perhaps only 4 times a month or 5 times a month, people who must then travel to their place of work because they have face-to-face and face-to-place activities begin to experience a public transport system which is not so congested, which is more available for them. And also the opportunities for people to live closer to where they work, not just by bringing work to home, but also by opening up the way real estate operates in central cities so that there are more conversions to residential as part of a mix. I think that these kinds of cities provide services both to residents and to non-residents. And in this respect, we start to think of visitors, not just as people who come for tourism and education, but people who live relatively nearby, but visit only 4 or 5 times a month. This kind of city has to have a strong identity, has to build a sense of belonging, not just for the people who live there, but for the people who don't live there, but are, as it were, members of the city. And so it emphasizes the idea of neighborhood combined with metropolis, combined with planet. Now, these ideas may seem a little bit far-fetched, but in fact, I think they're just an extension of a whole series of patterns that are already in train. I'm also grateful to my colleague Caitlin for working with me on these particular diagrams. And what we tried to do with these was to think about all of the different shapes and sizes that have been emerging in cities over the last period of time. If I can draw your attention to the bottom 4 on this chart, even before COVID-19, we were beginning to identify that the urbanization process, as we reached the 5th decade of this century of the city, was beginning to be more distributed. Not just the metropolitan areas that we all understand well, but the emergence of cross-border regions where a single labor force simultaneously lives in 3 different cities. or the emergence of these macro regions where a number of large cities are anchored together with an ecosystem of lots of smaller cities and towns connected digitally so that people can work within the labor markets that are anchored in the big cities, but they can live in the smaller cities and towns where the high quality of life, the different residential choices and options are. And we see this, for example, very much in the USA with the reurbanization of the third and fourth tier cities. People may have a job that's based in New York, but they can easily live in Montana or Ohio if they only have to go to New York once or twice a month to do their jobs. And similarly, we see this emerging in China, of course, with the growth of the 19 great city clusters. You can live in Suzhou or Nanjing and have a job that's based in Shanghai. So this idea of the blended city is the idea of a city in which you can be a member of that city and participate in its economy and its activities, whilst living quite a long way away. So the blended city contributes to this idea of distributed urbanization, which was already in train before COVID began. So what have I really said to you today? I've said COVID-19 is a health crisis. It's an economic shock, but it's also an opportunity to use the accidental experiment in low carbon, low mobility, low touch, low consumption living that we've been experiencing, combined with a kind of 7 imperatives that have emerged from COVID-19 as a way to begin to fashion a new normal, which is not just different from the old normal that we experienced before COVID-19, but has the possibility, offers perhaps the promise to be decisively better. I look forward to the conversation.
Wow, Greg. Thank you so much. You have given us a lot to think about. Yeah, and I love your diagrams there. And we have many questions. I will do my best to sort them and combine them. Everybody feel free to submit them on the Q&A app or function on Zoom. Greg, several early people who have written in have observed that this notion, this diagram of the distributed city looks a lot like Sydney. It looks a lot like Sydney historically with the network of what we call the Macquarie towns back to the 1800s. And it looks a lot like the vision for the future of Sydney with the metropolis of 3 cities that the Greater Sydney Commission has promulgated. And it looks like the vision for the Sandstone mega region connecting to Newcastle and Wollongong that the committee has put forward. Are we already there? What else needs to change for Sydney to move into this vision?
Well, I recognize exactly that observation. And I think that what I'm saying here is that COVID-19 is an accelerator of both of those visions. I see the vision of the Greater Sydney Commission for the metropolis of 3 cities as being absolutely a correct and intelligent vision, and one that will enable you to pursue spatial patterns which will be aligned with climate change, human health, active transport, and everything else. And I see the Sandstone region as being exactly an example of this distributed urbanization and this blended city that I've been talking about. So the issue, I think, in Australia is mustering the public support and the political commitment to build the infrastructure that's required to make these things a reality. And as you'll be aware from what I've been saying, that infrastructure is digital. It's also surface transport, but it's also, I think, building the idea that this is a way to encompass the future success of Sydney with the wider success of regional New South Wales at the same time. If you like, these two ideas are not opposite. It's possible to blend them in a mechanism that allows you to build the region and build the city all at the same time, if people are able to work flexibly, if they're able to engage in digital learning, if we're able to embrace a whole new set of behaviors that open up different land use and different transportation options.
Right. What ends up happening is smaller cities now get to compete based on attractiveness to live there. The problem of what people will do for work can be solved through this distributed network model. There might be different winners and losers in that new world where competing based on residential amenity is what determines how many people want to be in your town.
I think
all
that's
right. A
right.
lot of
Let me just make a quick comment there. You're right. There could be winners and losers. There could be a lot of winners and very few losers, or there could be a lot of losers and very few winners. And it depends upon connectivity, depends upon good place leadership at the local level, and it depends upon the degree that businesses are willing to embrace this distribution model.
Yes, yes. Well, I think that really gives all of us in Sydney a lot to think about, because of course we want all of regional Australia to prosper, and nobody wants only the cities to be successful. That's not a recipe for success. Greg, a lot of questions about transport. Your notion that this has been a forced experiment to trial new ways of living and working is very, very provocative, and I think resonates with everyone. One part of the experiment has been the mass abandonment of public transport. And there is a sign already in cities all over the world as they reopen that people are not flocking back to the buses and the trains, that they're afraid of them. As long as social distancing requirements are in place, the maximum loading factors will be a tiny fraction of what they once were, driving up the operating costs for the operators. How do we turn this into a positive?
Yeah, it's a very, very challenging question. And, you know, I'm lucky enough to interact with a lot of the metropolitan transport authorities around the world, and they're all talking about this. So I think the first thing to say is that citizen confidence, media reporting, investor appetite are all quite important variables in this. If we get to a comprehensively available, universally reliable vaccine, let's say within 24 months, then we will be able to risk assure public transport systems, gathering spaces, dense buildings in a new way. The issue is that people's behavior will have changed, and some of their behavior will never change back again. So I think there's a major task for transport authorities, as it were, to re-incentivize the rider once it's safe to do so. And there's a major challenge for state, provincial, national, federal governments to maintain the capability of transport authorities through that period and help them to be capable and competent when the time comes. At the same time, it would be madness if transport authorities and regional and other governments simply allowed people to jump back in their cars. Because as I was trying to explain, the link between car pollution, air quality, and respiratory health is now so obviously clear that simply jumping back into cars would be contributing to the next pandemic, as well as contributing to climate change in all the ways we don't want to see that happen. So I expect to see many cities around the world adopt new measures, whether it's dynamic road user charging, whether it's changes to parking regimes, whether it's congestion charging. There are a variety of measures where I think there will be efforts to dampen the use of the motor car. But that will only work, that will only be politically acceptable if cities also embrace all of these other modes of transport, the new multimodal approach, running, cycling, walking, scooters, small jitney buses, shared transport models. There are so many new models now. Introducing those, expanding those, making those more a part of the transport mix will be key. And embracing some of this relocalization agenda so that people are making different journeys. If you don't have to go to the CBD 5 times a week, but you only have to go once a week, then maybe you start to work in a co-working center that's near your favorite cafe, near your station or your park. There are all sorts of ways in which, for people who have the kinds of jobs that can be flexibilized, this provides opportunities for neighborhoods. And in the poorer cities of the world, where we have big, dense concentrations of population, this means much more about the siting of industrial activity and businesses. I would suggest that we're going to see a lot of business zones and economic zones established closer to where people live, not in places where simply it's efficient to put the real estate. So I see a lot of agility being required there.
Greg, there's a lot of interest in the question of whether global supply chains reorganize themselves, maybe more expensive countries get manufacturing again in a bigger way than they have. That's one of the meanings of this concept of relocalization that we hear so much about. Is that really happening? If not, what would it take to make that really happen? A lot of people wondering to what extent will we really truly see a significant reconfiguration of global manufacturing and supply chains?
Well, I think it's impossible to predict, but I think the issue is very clear. And let's just say that, you know, I'm more concerned in all of this for the emerging and developing markets, where there's been a very high degree of specialization in certain cities and towns and regions in single components or single products, or those that have become dependent upon tourism from wealthier nations, the links between you know, particular parts of ASEAN, let's say, who've set themselves up as manufacturing centers and tourism centers. We should be very concerned about their economic model and their ability to provide work and income for their very fast growing population. So there's a conscience part about this that's very important. But I do think that you're going to see a resurgence of interest in what we might call, you know, securing the products and the services that are required by a nation to guarantee its own resilience. So I think this will be particularly strong in food. It will be very strong in healthcare, medicines, medical equipment. It will be strong in energy supplies in particular, and it will be strong in the components of manufactured goods that are critical to national success. So that will be certainly in transport, certainly in various kinds of production, and particularly in digital equipment, hardware, in relation to all of the digital systems that we're now using. So smart manufacturing, clean manufacturing, I think will come back to our major cities. Those that have gone through the journey, you know, those of us who teach economic geography teach a 4-phase model of how economies develop from primary to secondary to tertiary to quaternary industries. And we have taught that the shift from manufacturing to services is an advancement. I think that model is now, in a sense, under question as we think more about resilience, diversification, essential supplies, relocalization in the national interest. The issue for regions is, of course, to make space for it and to make it commercially and financially viable. And there I expect to see quite a bit of intervention from state and provincial governments and others.
Greg, what would the blended city, the distributed city, mean for places like the Sydney Central Business District or other central business districts in major cities around the world, which are defined by lots of tall buildings, mostly office. All of them have some degree or other of residential and ground floor retail, but mostly the space being office. What is the future of central business districts in this world?
Yeah, well, actually, this is something I'm very excited about. And of course, every central business district is a little bit different, Gabriel, because they've all got different mixes of office and other things. But these central business districts tend also to be the places where our great cultural assets and amenities are sited. They're the places of the wonderful universities, the superb museums. They carry the endowment, the DNA of the city is very much visible and prominent there. And we've been using them over the last period of time as the most efficient place to congregate large numbers of workers. No bad thing, and many of us, have enjoyed that kind of working life. But I think the uptick in flexible working and digital working will mean that the very large office towers are going to have to become much more agile. Firstly, they're going to have to support a larger labor force that's coming in less frequently, but from a larger region. So this is the whole idea of the blended city. And that means that they're going to reconfigure themselves much more around the worker as the occasional visitor, not as the daily participant. That may involve some release of space for other functions. And I would predict, for example, that the number of people living in our city centres will increase. The number of spaces that are used in other ways for entertainment, for creative production, for cultural production may increase. I think that the very large office blocks will all go through a kind of right sizing model, and they'll adopt some of the modalities of co-working much more, creating shared communal spaces much more than individual desks. Hot desking, flexi working will be de rigueur. So just imagine what that does in terms of releasing some of the space that's currently taken up with workplaces for corporate workers, and think about what else you would like to do with that space in a place that's so rich in amenity and other things. So I think we're going to have some very exciting conversations about how to accommodate a smaller permanent labor force and a larger temporary labor force, and what kinds of buildings that produces, and how we're able to release some space for residential, for creative, for cultural, and for social activities. So I don't think this is the death knell of corporate real estate, but I do think corporate real estate will have to continue its journey of extreme agility. And of course, to recognize that real estate is now a service, it's not an asset, and how you augment that service with brand, with values, with flexibility, with customer choice is going to be key.
Several people have written in with basically the same, almost verbatim question. If a vaccine or a treatment is found quickly, that means, ironically, people can get back to normal quickly, and perhaps all of these changes will not be as likely to happen. Or another variant on that is, since Australia has navigated this so deftly at this point, the trauma is not as deep as it is in the UK. People here are not going to be primed to make the changes you're talking about in the same way. Any reactions to those observations?
Well, I've got two reactions that I recognize exactly what people are saying. I'm spending a lot of time in conversation with New York, Madrid, Milan, Hong Kong, Singapore at the moment, and everybody's having the same debate. If we get the vaccine within 12 months, does the new normal begin to look much more like the old normal? In other words, the duration of time that we have to wait before we have a vaccine, in a sense, limits the scope for making long-term changes, or limits the habit-forming changes in behavior that we've been going through. So I suppose I think, firstly, in all senses, time is a very important and rather subtle commodity here. The longer this period of uncertainty goes on, in your model, Gabriel, of lockdown, transition, recovery, new normal, the longer those first three phases take, the more scope there is for people to establish new patterns of behavior, and for those new patterns of behavior to induce other kinds of changes, and also to prolong the nature of the recession. The deeper and longer the recession is, the larger the sorting shifting and changing effect that it has. The shorter and sharper it is, the more the economy we go back to is similar to the one that we had before COVID. So that's one thing. But the second big variable here, of course, is citizen and leadership appetite. I mean, surely the larger question is, do you want to go back to the old normal? Or do you want some of these elements of the new normal that I've been talking about? And I think this is the real debate that underlines this. For some people, this is the opportunity to make climate change and the addressing of global warming the kind of the key idea of our time. For other people, this is the digital paradise that they've been waiting for. For some people, this idea of the blended distributed city is the model they've been thinking about for hundreds of years. So I think this provides opportunities for people to shape change, to lead the debate, and to really encourage people to think about, you know, how would we like the new normal to be different to the old normal? Of course, that's what the Committee for Sydney are doing day in and day out. But I think this is a very important opportunity for a new kind of public discourse, a new set of inspired conversations.
Yes, that's incredibly inspiring for the committee and for everybody listening who is not just wanting to passively observe what happens, but we're wanting to shape what happens. Greg, I'll ask you one final question. I have so many great questions here. I wish I could get through them all, but let me ask a question about advice for medium-sized cities like Newcastle or smaller cities. What should those places be doing to take advantage of the opportunities that emerge in this moment?
That's a very good question. And, you know, Newcastle, New South Wales is a fascinating place, right? This is a city that's gone through a whole process of industrialization, deindustrialization, urbanization, suburbanization, and then the renewal through globalization of a whole focus on a commodities industry which makes enormous revenues but has only a small number of people, and then the re-emergence of a new kind of urban economy in Newcastle, the relocation of the university into the city centre, the restructuring of the urban form, the creation of the new metropolitan transport system with the arrival of the first tram, you know, the re-establishment of Newcastle Airport and its growth. So Newcastle is doing, I think, some of the right things, right? It's focusing on having a vibrant, interesting city centre, making the university and, well, not just the single university, but the university and a cluster of amenities real assets. So it's building a kind of urban quality of life. It's emphasizing a public transport system that means you can have a small city that works in an efficient way and doesn't get constrained by congestion. And then it's got an amazing range of housing choices coupled with an absolutely gorgeous natural environment, including, of course, a wonderful shoreline. So what's not to like? I think Newcastle is already on the journey to becoming part of this distributed city that is, you know, the Sandstone region. And I think that it just needs to keep going with all of those plans, probably needs to start telling its story even better, probably really expand its role as a higher education hub, which it's already doing, and probably focus on that amazing quality of life, the cuisine, the lifestyle, and everything else. Tell that story very well and recognize that its client base is not just international visitors and tourists and students, but its client base is anyone who wants to be part of the economy of the Sandstone region and wants to lead a distinctive kind of quality of life. So for Newcastle and for many other cities and towns of smaller size, this is a fantastic opportunity. And we need to kind of tell them that this big uptick in digitization, the change towards flexible working, the reimagining of the city creates an opportunity for them to be part of something that's much bigger, this distributed region, and to be part of this blended city idea. And I think it's very exciting. And that's why, we should really encourage the regions to look at this as an opportunity, not to defeat Sydney, but to unite with Sydney in this new network approach.
Greg, this has been an incredibly interesting and inspiring set of ideas. Thank you, and thank you to HSBC for making this possible. We have our work cut out for us, but we have the opportunity to live up to this call, to think about which parts of this forced experiment we want to carry forward, and which ways we want the world coming out of this to be different. Everybody, thank you for joining today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live. We will look to see you at the next one.